Welcome to our Expert Voices series as part of the program on economics and energy at the Middle East Institute. I'm Karen Young, and it's a pleasure to have Carole Nakhle joining us today to talk about the energy transition across MENA. Carole is CEO of Crystal Energy. She's an expert on oil and gas markets in the Middle East. And Carole, thank you so much for doing this today.
Thank you very much, Karen, for having me with you.
So, Carole, I would really like to get your view when we think about the energy transition across the Middle East, North Africa, and those oil companies which are well positioned to take advantage of maybe increasing market share, of buying up some assets of weaker oil producers, and then making a transition themselves into renewable products or into transition fuels like LNG. How do you see this transition unfolding, and who are the winners and the losers?
Well, Karen, when you talk about the energy transition, we immediately think that any oil and gas producing country is going to lose out because energy transition simply means moving away from fossil fuels, including oil and gas, and greening the global energy mix. So, of course, if you are an oil and gas producing country in the MENA and most of government revenues come from hydrocarbons, then you ought to be worried. But we have to dissect the energy transition to different phases in terms of different time frames because it's a long-term process. It's not something that happens overnight. So here I can see not a problem, but actually an opportunity for many MENA countries to take advantage of this transition as happening gradually. And what I mean with that is the following. The MENA is blessed with some of the lowest costs in terms of exploring and producing oil and gas. And usually when we talk about energy transition, we're talking indirectly about a shrinking market for oil and gas. And in a shrinking market, you usually have competition intensifying, and the countries that would be left last standing in this kind of shrinking market are the ones that have the lowest cost of production. So this by itself would give many MENA countries, oil and gas producing countries, an advantage. That, however, is conditional on the following. They need to diversify their economies so they can sustain low oil prices. And here I have to refer to the pandemic, the crisis. We always say that there is a silver lining in every crisis. And for me, in terms of oil and gas and MENA, the true silver lining is that it has given those producers a taster or a snapshot of how the world will look like when we actually hit oil demand peak and demand starts to decline. And you can see what happens to prices. Today, they are all suffering from the lower oil price environment that prevailed post-COVID-19 and which translated to massive production cuts. So you have lower volumes being put in the market. But if these economies, if these producers are able to diversify away from oil and gas and therefore being able to sustain lower prices, I guess they will be able to benefit from the energy transition for a certain period of time. Of course, in the longer term, they have to take into consideration that maybe at some point nobody wants to buy their oil and gas and they have to be prepared for it. So this is where accumulation of savings from oil and gas will play a very important role. So you end up translating the assets in the ground into financial resources that can sustain you for many generations to come. And here I reach answering your question that if you look today at those who are likely to emerge as winners, they are the ones who have low cost reserves and they can be pretty spread across the region. But those who are economically speaking better positioned than their counterparts in the region. And here I would like to say the UAE, for example, with their massive financial reserves accumulated, Kuwait, they can sustain better conditions than, let's say, countries such as Algeria, and to a lesser extent, smaller producers such as Egypt. So it's quite a mixed bag that you have in the MENA, but I fear that if they cleverly focus on their economic structure and economic makeup, they can actually emerge as winners from the energy transition, at least for a certain period of time.
Carole, if we could talk a little bit about sort of how countries across the Middle East, North Africa are actually preparing for, an energy transition in terms of their own revenues, but also what they can do in domestic power generation. Where are we seeing countries that have been sort of forward thinking in terms of finding alternate or renewable sources of electricity generation, for example?
The MENA stands out from most regions around the world in many ways, but in terms of energy, it is the least diversified region in terms of energy mix because if you look at their energy portfolio, it's super straightforward. It's mainly oil and gas with tiny bit of nuclear energy in the UAE, for instance, or maybe hydropower in other countries. But really, we're talking about oil and gas dominating both the primary energy mix and the electricity mix. In the electricity, and this is another feature, unique feature of the region, it is perhaps the only region in the world which is still burning significant quantities of oil for domestic power generation. And that, in my view, is a massive waste of a valuable resource. So what you see today, the energy transition, we talk about it happening in the region. We see big projects announced, for green projects, whether renewable energy projects, including solar or even hydrogen projects, such as the one that were announced in Saudi Arabia. And actually, across the region, several oil and gas producers announced commitments to big hydrogen projects, or even nuclear energy is also gaining some traction in the region, yet we are still waiting for those announced projects or targets to be fully implemented. And that by itself is not just a win situation for the region in terms of reducing its carbon footprint, but it allows the region to reduce the usage of oil in power generation and therefore frees up more volumes of oil to be exported and therefore earning a better financial reward for these producers. So it's like hitting two birds with one stone, greening your energy mix and also treating your valuable natural resources in a better way. Now, when you look today at what these countries are doing, they seem to be focusing primarily in terms of greening their energy mix on hydrogen. And here I'm talking about blue hydrogen, because blue hydrogen, it is derived from fossil fuels, particularly in the region from oil and gas. And hydrogen has been produced in the region primarily as a feedstock for petchem, for the petrochemicals, and also to reduce sulfur in refining process. So the technology is already there, but as long as it's not applicable along carbon capture and storage, then the production of hydrogen will continue to emit CO2. So the region is trying to kind of bridge between extending the life cycle of their valuable assets, oil and gas, and at the same time reducing their carbon footprint by producing hydrogen plus CCS, and that's why we call it blue hydrogen. So these are, I think, where the main focus of the national oil companies are today. They are also investing in carbon capture and storage. And if you look again, like hydrogen, carbon capture and storage will allow the region to continue producing oil and gas, but at a lower carbon footprint. So the national oil companies of the Middle East, and particularly in the GCC countries, seem to be putting more weight on these technologies where they already have expertise and where they can have a massive competitive advantage because of the low cost of feedstock that is oil and gas. And therefore they can produce hydrogen at a lower cost than elsewhere. And who knows, when hydrogen becomes much more developed than where it is today, then we expect to see a global market for hydrogen. And the Middle East, again, if they wisely succeed in implementing those technologies, they can gain a big advantage as being here the low-cost exporters of hydrogen.
That is so informative. Thank you so much.